On a quiet Tuesday morning, just as the city's luxury boutiques were beginning to unlock their gleaming glass doors, Melanie Winslow stepped off the curb and crossed the narrow, cobblestoned lane that led to Maison Ponsard, a fashion institution, nestled on the corner of Maple and Third. She wore a soft cream wool dress that hugged her frame modestly, the hem falling just below her knees, paired with a weathered oatmeal-colored trench coat tied loosely at the waist. Her boots, flat and worn, made almost no sound on the polished pavement. Her dark hair was gathered in a simple low bun, and a faded canvas tote hung from her shoulder, the kind artists or seamstresses might use, lined with swatches, notepads, maybe a half-eaten apple wrapped in a napkin. From the outside, she looked like someone's quiet neighbor, someone who took the bus instead of an Uber, someone who still mailed handwritten letters. She was beautiful, but in a way that revealed itself slowly, in the curve of her cheek when she smiled, in the steadiness of her gaze, in how she never looked rushed. The boutique's windows shimmered with elegant displays, antique gold mannequins wrapped in velvet gowns, pearl-threaded shawls draped like delicate spiderwebs. Inside, the lighting was deliberately soft, casting everything, fabric, fixtures, faces, in a perpetual golden hour. Two shop assistants stood near the back, mid-conversation, sipping their cappuccinos from tiny porcelain cups. Their tailored blouses and hair pulled into tight buns marked them clearly as professionals in the world of couture sales. Melanie entered quietly, the small bell above the door giving a delicate chime, and the warmth of the interior enveloped her like a memory. She didn't speak, not right away. Her eyes moved. Not greedily, not even longingly, just thoughtfully, across the racks of dresses. Each piece looked like it had been stitched not just with thread, but with expectation, with exclusivity, with price tags that weren't displayed because they didn't need to be. Slowly, almost reverently, Melanie reached toward a burgundy lace dress hanging near the window, her fingertips grazing the hem. The fabric was soft and old-fashioned, like something from a grandmother's cedar closet. There was no lust in her touch, no rush. Only memory, maybe even love. From behind her came the sudden click of heels. One of the assistants, blonde and angular, appeared beside her, lips pursed, eyes narrow. Without a word of welcome or kindness, she reached out and smacked Melanie's hand away from the dress. Not hard, but sharp enough to send a clear message. "Please," the woman said with the kind of exaggerated patience that's used with small children or the very slow, "If you're not planning to purchase, do not touch the merchandise. It's delicate." Melanie blinked, surprised not by the aggression but by its casualness. She turned her head slightly, offering the assistant a polite, if puzzled, smile. She didn't respond, didn't argue. Instead, she took a small step back, eyes still resting on the dress. She looked not ashamed, but as though she'd just witnessed something private, something unnecessarily cruel. The assistant scoffed under her breath and returned to her colleague, muttering something that made them both chuckle. And just like that, the golden glow of the boutique seemed to shift. What had moments ago been a quiet, sacred space for beauty now felt cold, artificial. Melanie adjusted the strap of her tote and, without a word, turned and walked toward the door. But there was something in her posture as she left. Not defeat, not even sadness. Something quieter, deeper. Not one of the women inside suspected they would see her again. But they would. Very soon. The morning after her quiet exit from Maison Ponsard, Melanie sat alone in her small studio apartment, above a closed-down bookstore, sunlight catching on the steam rising from her tea. The space smelled of bergamot, beeswax, and fabric softener. A vintage dress form stood in the corner draped with an unfinished shawl made from wool she had dyed herself. Shelves bowed under the weight of fabric rolls, sketchbooks, and tin boxes filled with hand-sorted buttons. On the table beside her lay a folded newspaper from 2 weeks ago with a circled real estate listing, a printed architectural sketch, and a short handwritten note in careful cursive. To feel welcome is a rare kind of luxury. Preserve that. She traced the words slowly with the tip of her finger, reading them again before folding the paper and placing it in her bag. Her decision, unspoken even to herself until now, had begun forming the moment her fingers had been slapped away from that burgundy dress. Not out of pride or revenge, but out of something older, deeper. An ache for dignity, for spaces that didn't humiliate you for daring to admire what you might not yet afford. The same boutique that had dismissed her was now at the center of a subtle but significant change. The historic building in which Maison Ponsard operated had quietly changed ownership 3 months earlier, when the former landlord, an elderly architect battling illness, had transferred rights to a preservation trust. Melanie, who had once worked for that architect as a researcher, cataloging hand-drawn blueprints, was included in that trust as an advisory voice. Unbeknownst to most, she had inherited not just access but decision-making authority in the releasing of that entire property. An inheritance rooted not in wealth but in years of humble loyalty and quiet competence. And now, after yesterday's incident, she knew what she would do with it. That afternoon inside Maison Ponsard, the atmosphere remained as it always had. Curated, perfumed, and tight. The assistants Tammy and Elise stood behind the marbled counter, idly scrolling through their phones and sipping mineral water from sleek metal bottles. They were talking about the upcoming inventory rotation and which clients had reserved fittings for the gala season. Elise mentioned a woman from the Art Foundation who had called asking about custom sizing for older clients. Tammy rolled her eyes. Honestly, why bother? If they can't zip it up without help, they probably shouldn't be wearing it. They laughed, casually cruel in the way that comes with practiced detachment from people who aren't present to defend themselves. Just then, a courier entered with a manila envelope, asking for the manager on duty. Tammy took the envelope, signed for it, and, with barely a glance, tore it open. Her casual expression sharpened as she read. Elise noticed the shift in her friend's face and stepped closer. "What is it?" she asked, already anticipating gossip. But Tammy didn't answer right away. She read the letter again, slower this time, the corners of her mouth tightening. Finally, she placed the document on the counter and flattened it with one hand. "It's a notice," she said, her voice dry. "The lease is being reviewed. As in, it may not be renewed. As in, we might not be here next quarter." Elise scoffed. "Reviewed? That's ridiculous. We've been here 12 years. "It says there's a new landlord. Ownership passed to someone else through a preservation trust," Tammy added, her voice wavering slightly now. "They're reassessing use of the property. Something about mission alignment. What does that even mean?" The two stood in silence for a beat, unsure whether to laugh it off or take it seriously. Tammy reread the name at the bottom of the page. Melanie Winslow, Development Advisor, Winslow Trust for Living Design. It didn't immediately register, just a name. An unfamiliar one. No titles, no logos. They had no idea that it belonged to the woman they had humiliated less than 24 hours ago. Later that day, Elise sent a casual email to the building management, expecting a quick clarification or apology for the confusion. She received a reply within the hour, a formal confirmation of the letter's authenticity, followed by a meeting invitation, mandatory for all tenants on the commercial floor, scheduled for Friday morning. The subject line read simply, "Transition Plan Review, New Ownership Update." Tammy stared at the email for several minutes before forwarding it to the boutique's regional manager with the terse note, "You may want to attend this one." By Thursday, whispers had begun. Other businesses on the block noticed subtle changes. Flower boxes removed from the windowsills, a man with a clipboard inspecting drainage lines. Elise spotted a new name on the mailbox downstairs, Winslow Living. Still, she wasn't worried. Whoever this Winslow woman was, surely she wouldn't displace a boutique as storied and established as theirs. Prestige protected them. The clientele, the press coverage, the legacy. Didn't it? Tammy wasn't so sure. She remembered the quiet girl with the canvas tote, the one she'd slapped on the hand. She remembered, too, the way that girl hadn't reacted, not with outrage or embarrassment, but with a kind of resigned stillness. That stillness unsettled her now in retrospect, like the silence that falls before a building is demolished. By the time Friday arrived, with the air unusually dry for early spring, the boutique's mood had shifted. Staff were stiff, unusually polite to passing customers. Elise arrived in heels instead of her usual loafers. Tammy wore lipstick and a blazer. They both stood straighter than usual when the bell above the door chimed at 10:01 and 3 people stepped inside. A man in a slate-colored suit, a woman with a clipboard, and a third figure. Familiar but different. Melanie Winslow, dressed in the same quiet palette as before, but now with unmistakable purpose in her stride, crossed the boutique floor and stopped at the center, looking around with eyes that missed nothing. The quiet girl had returned, not as a customer this time. Not to ask questions, but to ask for keys. For a few long seconds after Melanie stepped into the boutique, time seemed to slow, though the clock on the wall ticked steadily forward. The boutique's usual soundtrack of soft jazz playing over hidden speakers continued, but something about the room had shifted. The weight of the air, the pace of breath. Tammy blinked once, then again, trying to place the face before her. It was the same young woman, no doubt, the one she had slapped on the hand just days before. But something was different now. Her posture, the way she looked at the space, not with reverence or nervousness, but with the dispassionate calm of someone taking inventory of what would stay and what would go. Her dark hair was loose now, flowing in soft waves over her shoulders. She wore a tailored wool coat the color of ash, a slate blue scarf, and modest heels. She carried no purse, only a thin leather folder clutched in one hand. The man and woman behind her, both dressed in the corporate language of neutral tones and sensible shoes, flanked her slightly, clearly present in a supporting role, not leading. It was obvious to anyone watching that Melanie was in command, even if no one understood quite yet what her command meant. She took a few steps forward and stopped in front of the same display where the burgundy lace dress still hung. It had been moved slightly, rotated on its hanger, but the lighting cast the same soft glow onto the fabric. Melanie glanced at it just briefly, then turned her eyes to Tammy. "You're the senior associate, correct?" Her voice was calm, low, precise, absent of accusation, but weighted with expectation. Tammy straightened reflexively, her fingers curling slightly around the edge of the counter. Yes, I manage the floor most days." Her voice sounded thinner than she intended. Elise, half a step behind her, remained silent. Melanie gave a single nod. She then turned slightly toward the suited man on her left. "Michael, would you please hand me the lease review packet?" The man obliged without a word, retrieving a document from his briefcase and offering it to her. Melanie placed it gently on the counter and began unfolding it. Per Clause 7 at a C of the revised occupancy agreement, all tenants are subject to periodic evaluation based on use alignment, code compliance, and community engagement. Your lease has not yet been renewed for the upcoming fiscal quarter, and at present, your continuance is not guaranteed. She paused only briefly, letting the words settle like a slow wave. Tammy stared at her, then down at the document, then back up again. "Wait, what does this mean? We've been here for 12 years. We've never had a complaint filed against us." Elise, still quiet, looked from Tammy to Melanie, her face starting to pale. "This is some kind of mistake. We were told the renewal was automatic unless we defaulted on rent." "No," Melanie replied simply. "You were told that by the previous landlord. The building is now held in trust, and that trust has different priorities. A review is being conducted, and based on what we've observed, it's unlikely this location will be deemed compatible with the trust's Community First model." Tammy bristled. "Community First? This is a high-end boutique. Our clients aren't looking for a community center. They come here for quality, for exclusivity, for—" She stopped herself, realizing too late how hollow the words sounded in this context. Melanie didn't react. She reached into her folder and pulled out a photograph. An old one, slightly worn around the edges. It was of a storefront from 30 years ago, the same address, but the building looked different. The windows were simpler, the signage hand-painted, and in front of the door stood a man in a wool coat and a young girl with dark hair holding a paper bag. "This was my father's shop," Melanie said softly. "A tailor's boutique. He built his business here before boutiques had PR teams or Instagram accounts. His clients were teachers, retired seamstresses, women who came in with buttons from coats they'd worn since before the war. He never turned anyone away." There was a moment of uneasy quiet. Even Elise seemed caught by the sincerity in Melanie's tone. But Tammy's defenses held. "That's a lovely story, but this isn't 1973. The city has changed. Client expectations have changed." Melanie nodded again, slowly. "Yes, but respect doesn't go out of style." Her voice remained calm, but there was an edge now. A gentle but undeniable shift in temperature. Elise, searching for something to grasp, finally spoke. "Look, If this is about what happened the other day, I don't think Tammy meant to be rude. She was just... Melanie cut in, still not raising her voice. I wasn't going to mention that incident. Then, after a pause, she added, but thank you for confirming it. Tammy flushed, visibly, her jaw tightening. So what happens now? She asked, attempting defiance but sounding more like a student waiting for a grade. Melanie didn't gloat, didn't enjoy the discomfort. Instead, she reached into her folder again and retrieved 2 more documents. You have 2 options. The first is to step down voluntarily by the end of the month. You'll receive severance, and I'll provide letters of recommendation for other positions, assuming there are no further issues. The second option is to stay and reapply, under new terms, new expectations. There will be interviews, background evaluations, and a probation period, no guarantees. Her tone was not cruel. If anything, it was gracious, but firm. There would be no misinterpretation. Tammy let out a short, humorless laugh. You expect me to reapply for the job I've had for 12 years? Melanie tilted her head slightly. No, I expect you to decide whether your pride is worth more than your place here. The phrase landed with a softness that somehow made it more cutting. Elise lowered her eyes, silent. At the far end of the boutique, a delivery boy entered, holding a bouquet of dried wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. Melanie walked over and took it gently from his hands, signed the receipt, and returned to the center of the room. She set the bouquet down on the counter beside the lease documents. When my father died, this building sat empty for nearly 2 years. No one wanted it then. Too small, too quiet, too far from the new shopping district. I bought it because I remembered what it felt like to be 10 years old, sitting under the sewing table and listening to women tell their stories while my father measured the hem of a skirt. That memory is the foundation of everything I'm about to build. She looked around, not at the dresses or the marble or the mirrors, but at the space itself. The bones, the breath of it. Then she turned back to the 2 women standing behind the counter. You've treated this place like it belonged to you. It never did. It belongs to the people who walk in here hoping to feel seen. And it's my job now to make sure they are. Neither Tammy nor Elise said anything more. Melanie didn't wait for them to. She gathered her folder, nodded once to her team, and walked out with the same quiet grace she had entered. The bell above the door chimed behind her, and the boutique remained still, filled now with silence, the kind that doesn't break easily. The following week unfolded like a slow turning of pages in a book no one had expected to read. The boutique remained open but subdued, its usual rhythm disturbed by a new kind of quiet. Clients came and went, but fewer than usual, as if the energy of the space itself had changed. Tammy continued to show up every morning, lips tight, voice quieter, eyes sharper. Elise floated around her, uncertain and oddly deferential now, as though she no longer trusted her own instincts. Neither of them knew whether they were still truly employed or merely ghosts occupying their former roles, waiting to be released or reborn. They went through the motions, folding scarves, steaming dresses, arranging displays, but the weight of judgment hung thick in the air, not from above, but from within. There was no official announcement, no memo, no firing. And perhaps that was what made it worse. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Melanie worked with quiet urgency. Her days began early and stretched late, each hour filled with fabric meetings, consultations with local artisans, legal reviews, and zoning permissions. She didn't hire a design agency or PR firm. She hired tailors from community centers. She brought in a young woman who repaired vintage machines to restore 2 rusted Singer models she had found in the building's basement. She reached out to retired seamstresses, some of whom had worked in this very building decades ago, and invited them to consult on fit, structure, and purpose. They came hesitantly at first, unsure whether this was real, but Melanie welcomed them not as symbols but as collaborators. She gave them tea, listened to their stories, and wrote down every suggestion. She wasn't trying to modernize the space. She was trying to reawaken it. One rainy afternoon, she sat alone in the back room of the boutique with her laptop open and a dozen swatches spread out before her like playing cards. The windows fogged slightly with the weather, and the room was lit only by a desk lamp and the distant sound of jazz filtering in from the showroom. On the screen, a draft of the new brand statement blinked cursor after cursor, waiting for her to finish. Maison Marienne, she typed slowly. Where beauty listens, and silence is stitched into every seam. She didn't know if it was good. She only knew it was true. Outside, Elise paused in the doorway, watching her. Melanie didn't notice at first. When she did, she gestured for the young woman to enter. Elise hesitated but stepped in, closing the door quietly behind her. She wasn't wearing heels today. Just soft-soled flats that made no sound. "I wanted to ask," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "about the position postings. The new structure. Will any of us be considered?" She didn't say me and Tammy. Just us, in that nervous way people use when they're trying not to sound selfish. Melanie leaned back slightly, closing the laptop. She studied Elise's face. Not hard, just long enough to know she wasn't performing. "That depends," she said, "on what you're willing to learn and unlearn." Elise gave a small nod. She was young enough still to be shaped, and maybe that was her greatest strength. Melanie picked up one of the swatches and passed it to her. "What do you think of this? For women with arthritis, it's a bamboo blend, softer than it looks." Elise took it gently, surprised. She rubbed the fabric between her fingers, looking not just at the material, but at Melanie. "It's warm," she said, "and forgiving." Melanie smiled faintly as though that was the correct answer, even if it wasn't the intended one. At the front of the boutique, the bell above the door chimed. A woman had entered. She was in her 70s, moving slowly, with the deliberate grace of someone used to being invisible. Her raincoat was buttoned all the way to the top, and her gray curls peeked out from beneath a navy cloche. Tammy, by force of habit, greeted her with a faint smile, but she didn't move from behind the counter. The woman wandered in silence among the displays, pausing before the same burgundy dress Melanie had touched a week earlier. She studied it for a long time, then turned to Tammy. "Do you have anything like this?" she asked gently. "But with sleeves? Something I could wear to my granddaughter's wedding. I'd like to feel beautiful again, but not like I'm pretending to be 30. Tammy blinked, uncertain, caught off guard by the honesty. She glanced around, searching for someone else to take over, but no one came. Finally, she said, "I don't know. Let me check." Her voice was almost kind, not warm, but unarmed. She disappeared into the back, not knowing what she would find or whether it would matter. The woman remained by the dress, fingertips resting gently on the fabric. Elise and Melanie stepped out moments later. Melanie smiled at the customer and asked her name. "Lillian," the woman replied. "My granddaughter says I should treat myself. She doesn't know how far that walk is for me now, just to feel seen." Melanie nodded slowly, then led her to a velvet chair and poured her a cup of tea from a pot that had appeared, as if by instinct, from the counter behind her. "I think," she said softly, "we can help with that." And for the first time in weeks, something shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, but undeniably. Not because of a policy or a headline or a confrontation, but because one woman asked for a sleeve and another didn't laugh. Because something old was being remembered in a new way. Because the boutique, once obsessed with image, had started to remember its shape. Melanie glanced around the room, not with pride, but with a quiet sort of hope. This wasn't about fashion anymore. It was about repair. Of fabric, yes, but also of something deeper. Of the space between women, of how we learn and how we listen, and how we begin again. The change, when it came, did not arrive with fanfare or press releases, nor with any dramatic overhaul of marble floors or chandeliers ripped from the ceiling. It came instead with silence, deliberate, structured, intentional. It was in the absence of the usual curated perfume at the boutique entrance, in the hum of vintage sewing machines installed in what used to be the fitting lounge, in the notes on thick paper pinned above the register that said simply, "We tailor. Kindness here." Melanie did not fire Tammy outright. There was no dramatic dismissal, no public confrontation. Instead, the space around Tammy slowly shrank, not by cruelty, but by irrelevance. Her responsibilities were reduced, clients began asking for others, and her voice no longer anchored conversations. She became, without declaration, an echo of the boutique's old self. Still standing in the center, but no longer at the center of anything. But Tammy was not someone who accepted fading easily. She began showing up earlier and staying later, her heels sharper, her smiles tighter, her tone increasingly brittle. She placed small orders without approval, hosted fittings that ignored the new accessibility standards Melanie had insisted upon, and rearranged displays to emphasize exclusivity again. Jewels in locked cases, do not touch signs reappearing like ghosts. At first, Melanie let it go, choosing her battles carefully, knowing that the architecture of a culture doesn't collapse all at once. But then came the Tuesday morning when everything tipped. It was just before opening, the boutique quiet, the front windows still fogged from the night air. Elise arrived first, carrying 2 boxes of newly printed catalogs that featured the store's rebranding. Older models photographed in natural light, holding hands with grandchildren, sitting on park benches in dresses that moved with them rather than clinging to their bodies. There were lines in the models' faces, folds in the fabric, and none of it had been edited out. Elise placed the boxes near the front counter and began unpacking them, lining the fresh catalogs side by side on the marble top. Tammy walked in minutes later, heels clicking across the tile. She looked down at the glossy covers, her mouth hardening, then without a word, swept them aside and replaced them with a stack of the older brochures. The ones that featured tall, thin women with expressionless faces and gowns priced without shame. Elise froze. She waited for a comment, a direction, anything that might explain the gesture. None came. Tammy simply walked into the back as though nothing had happened. It wasn't defiance anymore, it was sabotage. That afternoon, Melanie returned from a meeting with a local nonprofit that specialized in inclusive pattern design. She walked in carrying a canvas portfolio under one arm and paused when she saw the brochures at the counter. Her expression didn't change. She simply picked one up, flipped through it slowly, and set it down. Then she turned to Elise, who stood nearby, looking conflicted and exhausted. Melanie didn't ask questions. She didn't need to. Elise spoke first. She said the new ones were confusing the brand. She said our clients don't want to see themselves. They want to see what they could be if they tried harder. Melanie exhaled through her nose, not angrily, but as if releasing a deep and familiar grief. She nodded once, then set her portfolio down and walked toward the back. Tammy was in the inventory room, unpacking a shipment she had ordered without prior discussion. A line of dresses made by a luxury supplier with no ethical credentials and no inclusive sizing. Melanie looked at the packaging, touched the fabric, and then turned to Tammy, who had not looked up. "You didn't clear this with me," she said. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, and it made the weight of her words land harder. "I didn't think I needed to," Tammy replied, her hands continuing to sort tags. "I've been managing this boutique for 12 years. I know what sells." Melanie nodded again. "You know what sold, but that's not what we're building now." Tammy finally met her eyes. "What you're building is a fantasy. Dresses for women who want to feel good about mediocrity. Charity cases. Nostalgia. That doesn't survive in retail." Melanie stepped closer. "What doesn't survive in retail," she said quietly, "is contempt disguised as expertise." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Tammy laughed once, short and harsh. "You think you're saving the world with tea and hemming lines? You think kindness can replace margins?" Melanie tilted her head slightly. "I think kindness is the only margin that matters." There was silence again, but it wasn't peaceful. It was electric. Tammy stepped back as if to put space between herself and the softness she found so offensive. "If you're planning to let me go," she said, "do it. Don't waste my time with metaphors." Melanie shook her head. "You've already let yourself go, the moment you stopped listening. The moment you made this about being right instead of being useful." Then she added more softly, "You still have a choice. But not for long." Tammy didn't respond. She didn't apologize. She simply walked out, leaving the dresses half unpacked, the tags undone. Melanie stood there alone for a moment, then carefully began reboxing the shipment. Elise appeared in the doorway, uncertain whether she should help. Melanie nodded toward the boxes. "Return them. We don't need them." Elise stepped forward and began folding the garments quietly, her hands slow but sure. 2 days later, a notice was posted on the boutique's staff board. Effective Monday, all sales floor personnel will transition to roles based on revised community engagement criteria. Reapplications welcome. Tammy didn't show up that Monday. Her nameplate was gone from the drawer by the register. No one asked where she went. No one needed to. Instead, a new rhythm began. A retired textile teacher came in twice a week to lead stitching circles. Clients lingered longer, sipping tea, asking questions. Dresses were tried on and adjusted, not for perfection, but for comfort. There were smiles now, and sometimes tears. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the boutique transformed. Not just in how it looked or what it sold, but in what it meant to walk through its doors. The final moment of escalation wasn't dramatic. It was simple. A grandmother bought a dress for her daughter and said, as she folded the receipt into her purse, "This place reminds me of how stores used to feel, before we stopped talking to each other." Melanie, standing behind the counter, looked up and smiled, not with pride, but with recognition. Because that finally was exactly what she had been sewing back together. The day the boutique reopened under its new name began with no ribbon cutting, no local news cameras, no speeches. Just the unlocking of a door, the soft creak of hinges long unused, and the gentle clink of a bell that had hung above that threshold for decades. The new brass sign above the entrance now read, Maison Marienne, etched in a serif font both elegant and unassuming. A name that carried history, softness, and the echo of every woman who had ever walked into a store, hoping to be helped, not judged. The sidewalk outside had been swept clean that morning by one of the seamstresses, a woman named Rosa who hummed while she worked, the hem of her dress dusted in chalk from fittings done at dawn. Inside, the boutique was transformed, not with extravagance, but with care. Velvet chairs stood near wide mirrors with no slimming tricks. Curtains of linen hung loosely between changing areas, stitched by hand and deliberately imperfect. Tea steeped behind the counter, not in to-go cups, but in china patterned with tiny violets. The air smelled faintly of cedar and orange blossom. In the far corner stood a dress form draped in the same burgundy lace Melanie had once reached for, now altered, lengthened, softened. The sleeves were 3/4, the neckline higher. It was not a dress for a fantasy, it was a dress for someone real, someone who'd lived. Clients began to arrive in small numbers, women who had once passed the boutique without entering, who had told themselves they were too old, too large, too small, too tired for these kinds of places. And yet, they came. Some brought photos of weddings long past. Others brought tears they hadn't meant to shed. One woman brought a folded apron from her mother's sewing days and asked if the fabric could be salvaged into a sash. They weren't shopping for garments. They were searching for memory, for recognition, for gentleness. Melanie greeted each one with the same calm attention, listening not only to what was said, but what was meant. Late in the afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the high front windows and caught on the dust motes that danced quietly in the stillness, a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Tammy. She looked thinner somehow, though not physically. She wore a fitted blazer and sleek trousers, her hair tied high, makeup applied precisely. She stood for a moment, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe as though unsure whether she was stepping into a boutique or something else entirely. Melanie saw her, nodded once, and continued pinning a hem on an elderly woman seated beside her, gently lifting the lady's slippered foot and adjusting the fabric. Tammy waited, uncharacteristically silent. When Melanie finally approached, wiping her hands on a linen cloth, the two women stood face to face. No one else noticed them. The space was filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the rustling of tulle and muslin. "I saw the sign," Tammy said at last. Her voice was lower, almost careful. "I wanted to see what you'd turned it into." Melanie looked at her, not coldly, but without obligation. "It wasn't about turning it into anything," she replied. "It was about letting it become what it should have always been." Tammy nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the dress form in the corner. "That's the one," she said. "You reached for it. I slapped your hand away." "Yes," Melanie replied, without bitterness. Just acknowledgement. Tammy turned back toward the door, perhaps to leave, perhaps to say something else, but Melanie spoke first. "You thought I wanted the dress. I didn't. I wanted to understand the stitching. I wanted to know how it held its shape." Tammy paused, something unreadable passing over her face. "I didn't see you," she said finally. "I mean, I looked, but I didn't see." Melanie didn't respond. She didn't need to. The moment had unfolded completely, and it left no room for punishment. only clarity. After a silence that neither rushed to fill, Tammy said, "It's beautiful, what you've built. It's strange, but beautiful." Then she nodded once more, turned, and walked out into the amber light of late afternoon. Melanie returned to the hem she had been finishing. The woman in the chair patted her hand. "That used to be your manager, didn't it?" she asked quietly. "One of them," Melanie replied, "but I think she was just someone afraid she was disappearing." "We all are," the woman said, until someone looks at us and says, "I still see you." At that, Melanie smiled, and behind her in the boutique she had remade stitch by stitch, hour by hour, kindness by kindness. The sound of a kettle beginning to boil could be heard. Soft, steady, inevitable. By the end of the season, the boutique had stopped being a boutique in the traditional sense. It had become something else entirely, a place where the transaction was only a small part of the experience, almost incidental. Women came not just to purchase a dress or hem a sleeve, but to be reminded of something they'd almost forgotten, that they still mattered, that they still had taste, opinion, presence. That softness was not weakness, and that being seen, truly seen, had nothing to do with mirrors or lighting or price tags. On an ordinary Wednesday morning, Melanie arrived earlier than usual, the sky still tinted in blue-gray as she unlocked the front door. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, the furniture draped with linen covers from the night before. She walked through each corner slowly, touching the backs of chairs, smoothing a wrinkle in a curtain, lighting one small lamp in the fitting area where warm golden light began to fill the corners. She paused in front of the dress form, the burgundy lace gown still displayed, now accompanied by a small brass plate at its base that read, simply, "Worn once, felt forever." Later that day, a young woman entered, no more than 20, her voice soft, her jeans too short, her sweater borrowed from someone older. She led an elderly lady by the arm, her grandmother, it turned out, who had not bought a new dress in 15 years. "She doesn't want to be a burden," the girl whispered, "but she's going to my graduation and I want her to feel beautiful." Melanie knelt in front of the older woman, who wore orthopedic shoes and held a small coin purse in her lap, clutched like something sacred. "You already are," Melanie said, "but let's find something that agrees with you." As they moved toward the back, where soft fabrics waited and tea had already been poured, the camera of the moment widened. Not literally, but in the way memory sometimes does when it knows what matters. Outside, the new sign above the boutique gleamed in the spring light, a small ivy vine curling around the edge of the window. No headlines had ever announced its reopening, but word had traveled further than paper ever could, and as Melanie disappeared into the quiet hum of thread, hands, and breath, the space itself seemed to exhale, full of the lives it now carried. The bell above the door rang again, and no one flinched.